the Snoqualmie, and a number of other tribes, even all the way up to Swinomish and Samish, signed a treaty in Mukilteo. I also want to acknowledge the residents of Japantown, Mukilteo, who lived there from 1903 to 1930 and made that place their home. And I want to especially note Maso Doi, who gave us an oral history of his experiences growing up in Japanese Gulch. And I've shared in the chat with you a link to these slides in case any of you want to follow the links now or later, preferably. And you can check out Maso Doi's oral history of his experiences growing up in Japanese Gulch. There's also a number of partners that we worked with on this project. We've been working in Japanese Gulch actively since 2012, and we did some sporadic work previously in 2005 in the area. So we have a long-standing history, and listed here are a number of the partners we've worked with over the years, one of which has joined us today, Eric Adman from the Snow King Watershed Council. And there's also a number of groups that have funded this work as well. In that treaty that was signed back in 1855, Article 5 of that Point Elliott Treaty promised the Coast Salish nations that in return for sharing this land with the newcomers from the United States, that they could retain the right to take fish at usual and accustomed grounds and stations. That was a promise in the treaty that within a century of signing that treaty could not be honored at the very place the treaty was signed, because by the mid-1960s, or probably earlier, salmon had been exterminated from the stream in the very shadows of that treaty signing ceremony. And if you look at this map here, this map shows you the city of Mukilteo. This is an older map, so this is where the ferry terminal used to be. Now there's a new ferry terminal over here, or actually probably more like here. And this here is the project site where we did do our water quality monitoring. There's a little bit of water quality monitoring sites up here as well. And we did an archaeology project there as well that kind of stimulated this whole project. But you can see Japanese Gulch is a Puget Sound tributary that runs up from about Painfield Airport and Boeing down into the Sound. It's actually running north in this location because the way that there's the peninsula there that sticks out. But that treaty was signed in the vicinity over here. And yet here we have this promise in the very place the promise was made, and it's not being honored by those of us who are United States citizens, who have an obligation in return for living here, the right and privilege of living here, to honor that treaty. This place is not only important to Coast Salish nations, it's also important to a Japanese community. And Japanese immigrants arrived in the Mukilteo area first with the railway in about 1891. And you can see a historic photo of the railway here as it appeared in Mukilteo. So this is looking from Japanese Gulch to the west, or from the ferry terminal would be about right here. The old ferry terminal, the new one around here. And so they came in with that railway that was built in 1891, working on it. And then Mukilteo Lumber, which is this big plant here. This plant is actually Crown Lumber, as it was called later, but it was initially called Mukilteo Lumber in 1903. And they hired about 35 Japanese workers that grew to around 100 after the plant was renamed Crown Lumber in 1909. And these Japanese workers lived in company housing. And this is historic photographs of that company housing that's in Japanese Gulch. And they lived there until Crown Lumber closed in 1930. It was a casualty of the start of the Great Depression, the banking collapse. And in the years following, the buildings burned down and the community dispersed. You'll see, though, there's an interesting thing happened in Mukilteo relative to other communities around us. in that there definitely were tensions even here between the Japanese and the European immigrants. But in Mukilteo, relative to the other areas, it was very integrated. And you can see that through this school photograph where you have Japanese and European students going to classes together. And not only was it in the integration in the schools, but the Japanese and European workers allied in a strike in, I think if I remember right, it was around 1917 at the mill. And because they allied together, they were actually successful, and everyone got a raise 50 cents as a result of that. And I think that was a per day, if I remember right. But it was the unity, the ability of the community to come together that made it kind of a important historical element in race relations in our area. Well, that's kind of the background history of Japanese Gulch in particular. The way Edmonds Community College got involved in projects there was in response to a community need. And of course, our service learning projects that we do in the community are ways that we try to get students involved in addressing community identified needs. This need came to our attention as a result of a commitment that Edmonds College made in 2007 to do environmental education as part of a future Washington Aerospace Training and Research Center. And now that research center is in the Painfield Airport, and Edmonds offers classes there that are all oriented around aerospace. Well, the college was trying to figure out, well, how do we do that commitment to environmental education? And the deputy director of the airport at the time, his name was Bill Llewellyn, was insisting that we honor that aspect of the agreement. And so the college president at the time brought Bill Llewellyn to campus and had a meeting with me. And I was at the time the service learning, well, I still am the service learning faculty liaison. And so as part of my responsibility was to develop service learning projects for students. And I was tasked with the responsibility of fulfilling this commitment to do environmental education in Japanese Gulch. And so we looked for a lot of different opportunities. We did some monitoring of the beach for juvenile Dungeness crab was one of our early projects. And we were looking for some additional environmental projects. And we've been talking about things, but we hadn't done a lot yet until 2009, when Painfield Airport identified 4 seasonal non-fish bearing streams that were going to need to be filled to meet new FAA runway safety requirements. And those are pictured here in this image. And so they were going to basically fill these wetlands. And in order to fill them, the Clean Water Act requires some mitigation as a result. And so the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife recommended mitigation as a way of making up for the damage that they're doing, and identified Japanese Gulch as a priority location for doing some mitigation. And because of some changes in the laws at the time, they were able to do something unusual in terms of environmental policy history. This is one of the first example in the state of what's called an in lieu mitigation fee that was paid to the city of Mukilteo. So rather than the airport doing the work themselves, what they did is paid the city of Mukilteo to do some restoration work in Japanese Gulch. And we at that time agreed that the college's role would be to do environmental monitoring related to that project, so that we would help assess the effectiveness of their restoration project through the ecological monitoring. Now, what the WDFW and Tulalip tribes recommended as mitigation at this site was the removal of 4 barriers. And those barriers were a junction box, a perched culvert, an engineered channel, and wetland connectivity that disrupted the life cycle of salmon. And I have some photos that are in a minute that'll show you a little more detail here. But if you look at these photos, You can see this is an aerial photo of Japanese Gulch. This is the sound out here. This is the old Air Force tank farm that's slowly being replaced. And the first culvert, that perched culvert was right here. This is the railroad going up here. And the stream is not easy to see here, but the stream came along here and then went up a engineered channel around alongside the railroad. And they wanted to get that back into its historic channel. We can see it a little better here in the LiDAR. The LiDAR kind of removes the vegetation, and we can kind of peer down behind the vegetation and see, whoops. We can see the historic channel. Here's the engineered channel, and here's the historic channel that occasionally, seasonally anyway, had some water in it. And the idea was to reconnect the stream to this channel, and that would allow favorable salmon habitat, spawning habitat. Then this engineered channel that was partially enclosed with concrete just wasn't feasible. And so the goal of the project was to work on removing these 4 barriers. Here's a kind of a look inside this is the perched culvert in phase 1. You can see inside that box culvert that it's just across the road from where the video took students up or the green team at least, up the stream. This is a view inside. You can see it was just this flat concrete, the water just coming down there in kind of a sheet. And so it wasn't easy for salmon to get up in there. Occasionally they'd be seen in there, but rarely could they get above there. And so this here is what was put in. They put in these baffles. This baffle's holding the water, building a pool, and these rocks creating some structure to the stream. And now, as a result, salmon can navigate through this culvert. And so they're coming from the saltwater, which is over here. They're coming up into here. Phase 2 was to install a stacked culvert fish ladder to replace a perched culvert underneath the railroad. And so here's the perched culvert before it was rebuilt. And that perched culvert, you can see, is a long drop that salmon would have difficulty getting back up. And so creating the salmon ladder allowed much more navigable jumps for coho and other salmon to be able to come on up and go into the into that culvert. And inside the culvert, they put a series of baffles. These are metal rings rather than wood that we see here, but these a series of baffles that pool the water within the culvert as well. So these projects were done in July and October of 2010. And phase 3, the intent was to fix another barrier. This one, the engineered channel I mentioned before. So here you see a line drawing of that engineered channel. Here's the historic channel. Here's a photograph of the mouth of the engineered channel at the bottom. And here's one of the kind of perch waterfalls in that culvert. So you can see very difficult for salmon to be able to get up that section of the stream. And so the idea was to reconnect the stream by running it back into this historic channel at both ends. Then phase 4, the plan was to reconnect to a wetland. There's a wetland over here just to the east of the creek. And this wetland had an outlet going into the creek, but the outlet could use some baffles to slow the water down, create pools so that the salmon could climb up it. And this was recommended by the Tulalip tribes as a mitigation to provide spawning habitat, or I should say rearing habitat for juvenile salmon. And that was the intention of phase 3 and phase 4. Now, the city ran into some trouble. In the process of doing this is a known archaeological site, and when there's construction occurring in a known archaeological site, the contractors were required to have archaeological monitors. And this is where Alicia came in. I think you might have been one of the monitors that at this point in time. But these archaeological spotters basically stopped the work when they found artifacts of the apparent Japanese American origin that were unearthed by the contractors and city employees. And here's a picture of a backhoe pile that came out of the area, that phase 4 part of the project, and it was just full of artifacts, just full of them. And there was leather and wood and ceramics and glass and charcoal, lots and lots of artifacts in there. And so at that point, the project stopped. And I got a call a little while later from Bill Llewellyn at the airport. And he said, well, you're an anthropologist, right? And I said, yes. And he said, well, you know that Japanese Gulch project that you're going to do the monitoring for? He says, well, we run into a problem with the archaeology. We encountered artifacts, and our project has been stopped, and we can't afford to fix it. And he said, could you do archaeology too? Now, I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist, and I've also had a fair amount of training in archaeology, but I'm by far, I didn't have the skills to lead the archaeology project myself. But we did have the curriculum in place at Edmonds to do an archaeology field school. And I said, well, let me see what we can do. Maybe we could put together a field school. And so after a bit of discussion, we came to an agreement. I had a grant at the time from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to involve students in service learning through mentoring activities. And we were able to allocate some of that money to this project. And in combination with the city, we hired AMEC, which is a cultural resource management firm, or at least was at that time, that helped us to do an archaeology field school. So here's some pictures from that archaeology field school. And you can see our excavation pits, which were at the location where we reconnected the stream to the historic channel. Here's that wetland connection where that big pile was. We sifted through that, and then we did shovel test pits along the route of the stream to see if there were more artifacts. Turned out almost all the artifacts were concentrated where they first put in that backhoe. There weren't a lot further up, but you know, that's the way it goes. And so this archaeology was also mitigation for the damage that was happening to cultural resources. And so those materials were cleaned, collated, and collected, and I believe they're now at the Burke Museum. And that is where they were intended anyway. There were some hiccups getting them there. So so that project occurred in the summer of 2012. In the summer of, or by the end of that summer, the construction started reconnecting the stream. And so these are photos of the stream as it was put back together into that historic channel. Down here, you can see those baffles that connect that wetland area. And this is where the big backhoe had dug up right here, and there was a big pile of dirt here. And here you can see on the other side of the railroad are where the historic channels reconnected and the stream was rebuilt. So this project was completed in October of 2012, and our monitoring was to start at that time. Now we had started before we did the archaeology, actually back in January of 2012, we had started our wildlife monitoring in the area. And so we had wildlife cameras that we'd send students down to check the wildlife cameras. And just a couple weeks after this project finished, students going to check the wildlife cameras documented salmon returning to Japanese Gulch for the first time in at least 50 years. And so we had rather immediate results. These are the photos of those first two coho that made it up into the stream. Here's some more. And we got really immediate results by just removing those barriers, and salmon immediately came. And the city then gave us some mitigation funds that ultimately came from Snohomish County to do a series of annual contracts to fund student-led salmon surveys through 2018. And then we would later get some additional funds from a Water Quality Enforcement Act against Ace Metal. And they basically ended up paying us to do some of this monitoring as mitigation for violating the Clean Water Act. And that was facilitated through Puget Soundkeeper Alliance. And so what I'm going to do now is summarize some of that research, including our water quality data. But we didn't just do water quality data. Like I said, we've done some archaeology here. I won't be summarizing all of that data. We just don't have enough time. But I will go through the fish, wildlife, and water quality data. And so beginning, as I said, in 2012, we started these systematic surveys. And these are maps of the different areas that we were surveying in Japanese Gulch, indicating our wildlife camera locations, which varied over time, our water quality collection points that are indicated with the water, and the stream and so on are represented here. And so this is kind of a bigger picture as well. And then over here, you can see kind of a close-up where this is the culvert going under the railroad. Here's that historic channel that's been reconstructed. So you can see these are a little bit of our Japanese Gulch monitoring sites. Well, we wanted to do comparative monitoring, so we didn't just look at this site, we wanted a comparison. And Big Gulch also begins at Painfield Airport. You can see in this picture down here, Japanese Gulch is going to the north, and Big Gulch is flowing to the west, and both go into the Puget Sound, but both begin up at Painfield Airport. And so Big Gulch, being one of the largest streams of 13 streams coming off the airport, was a good comparison site to work off of. And so here you can see our salmon and water quality monitoring sites in Big Gulch. And Big Gulch you can access up at 92nd Street Park in Mukilteo. And then we have an access point down by the sewage treatment plant that's not open to the public, but we are able to get down there with students. And so now I want to summarize some of our data over basically this data is summaries because we put in our systematic protocols in 2013 for the salmon monitoring and ran those through 2018. The first year, 2012, we only documented the salmon when we happened to see them. And then in the subsequent years, we came out several times a week and documented salmon in the stream. And Grace Cole, who's on this call, she led a lot of these surveys, and I think was the only student to go from the start to finish in that whole project. And she's also one of the co-authors of the report. And I put that report in the chat as well, the full report that this slide show is about, if you want to take a closer look. But this shows you our cumulative salmon sightings over that period. I want to point out just a few things. Notice that there are low numbers of salmon found every year. In Japanese Gulch, we found coho every year. We didn't find chum every year. We only found chum one year in 2017 in Japanese Gulch. Chum is a different species of salmon. And then in Big Gulch, we found coho sporadically. So there were a couple of years where there were no coho in 2013 and 2015. And then there was even one year where there were no chum, or at least the live chum. I should say that we did find deceased coho that one of those years, okay, the 8 deceased. And so you can get a sense of the number of fish. The number of sightings is how many times we saw and counted fish, but sometimes we would count the same fish twice because we'd be there on, say, Tuesday, and then we'd come back on Saturday, and the same fish might still be in the stream. So that those total sightings are how many times we saw the fish. Of course, this is an undercount because we didn't see every fish we did our best, but there were definitely fish that escaped our notice. So these are like minimal numbers, if you will. Notice that one year we had 1,057 sightings, and it was mostly chum. That was in Big Gulch. We could almost walk across the stream on the backs of the chum. There were so many of them in certain parts of the stream, and it was a wild year. But like say other years, we hardly had any. And so here you can see the data mapped in a graph, and you see that big spike as well. And notice in Japanese Gulch, salmon came back, but the numbers never got very big. And in fact, we found that they were impeded over the long term by invasive species that are still a serious problem in Japanese Gulch. And if they don't get that fixed, I don't think it's going to remain a viable salmon habitat. Whoops. So here's kind of a portrait of 1 year of our survey, 2018, and showing you how the salmon were distributed along Japanese and Big Gulch. You can see that in Japanese Gulch, the only fish we found in this lower part were dead ones. All the living fish we found were up in the upper reach. And this area now is overgrown by invasive species here that impede the salmon spawning. In the first few years, they were spawning right up in here. They can't spawn there now because of invasive species. And you see them getting up at least as far as they can. And so you can see that the salmon find the habitat they prefer and will build their redds or their nests there. Then in Big Gulch, there's a sewage treatment plant here, and alongside the sewage treatment plant, we find a lot of salmon in there. But especially further up, we find our biggest concentrations of salmon up here. And further, the chum will go, or the coho will go further up the stream than the chum. But you can see that they do have certain areas where they concentrate, and those tend to be the pools that they like to rest in during the day. And so get a sense of that. Now let's talk a little bit about the water quality. So we started doing we didn't start the water quality at the beginning because we had a contract from the city to do the salmon monitoring. The only thing they were paying us to do was the salmon monitoring. And even that, they weren't paying us enough to cover our costs even for that. But we continued to do the wildlife monitoring because it was a really popular project with the students and a really valuable learning experience. And we decided to add water quality monitoring when the Snow King Watershed Alliance or Council was building a network of water keepers around our area to monitor water quality. So we put ourselves, the team, and this team was led a lot by an AmeriCorps member, and then Casey McCarty for a few years was the field tech that ran this project. And now the green team has revived it after Casey left for another job. And you can see some of the results over that 4-year period. I'll point out a couple of interesting ones. We found really high spiking of E. coli in Big Gulch in the spring of 2016. And we identified the city of the problem, and they were actually able to identify the source of the problem relatively quickly because it was one of their contractors that was the cause of the problem. And so they had diverted the stream for a city construction project into a pond that had a lot of E. coli in it, and then that was running down the stream. So they were able to fix it really quickly and solve that problem. So the students being out there in the field, as that video said, monitoring and helping know what's going on, had a very positive difference with the city here in being aware that something had changed and notifying the appropriate authorities and getting it fixed. Another thing that I want to highlight here is a mystery. It's an unexplained surge in pH, alkalinity, and turbidity that corresponded with the failure of coho to return to Big Gulch in November of 2016. So I mentioned that we had a couple of years that no coho came back to Big Gulch. We weren't doing water quality monitoring the first time we observed that, but in 2016, we noticed some anomalous numbers in our water quality at the same time coho didn't come back. Now, as a scientist, I can say that's a correlation, not necessarily a causation, but it gives us suspicion to think that maybe the water quality had something to do with the failure of coho to return. Now, it could have also been a fishing boat had set up outside of the mouth of the stream and took all the fish before they could get in. So we don't know for sure, but it's indicative that water quality might very well be part of the problem for sporadic returns of coho in Big Gulch. And so again, that data that students are collecting really makes a difference as we can look at it over the longer term. So another thing that we noticed is that a lot of the salmon were dying before they spawned. And so we implemented some protocols to do some kind of like autopsies or necropsies of these salmon that were dying. Here you can see a female who's died and is full of eggs. So she hasn't spawned. And so this means that they're getting into the stream. The barriers have been removed, but they're dying before they can reproduce. And this is a known problem in Puget Sound tributaries, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has been working for quite a long time to try to figure out what the source was. They've actually now identified that the source of the problem is coming from chemicals used in tires. And we didn't know that at the time. We knew it had some association with roads, but now we have a pretty good idea why. And other than perhaps a little bit in the turbidity, our water quality data didn't have the precision that we needed to be able to solve that problem. Like I said, it took decades of scientific work at a much more sophisticated level than we can do with students in the field to solve this mystery of why salmon were dying. But we are getting pretty high numbers of salmon death in both Big Gulch and Japanese Gulch. 40% of the salmon who returned to Japanese Gulch during our surveys and 87.5% that returned to Big Gulch during our surveys died before they spawned. So that's showing that we can't just restore habitat, we've got to address the water quality issues. These water quality issues that we're measuring are part of the problem, but not the whole problem. And so again, working with agencies like NOAA can help us address that. And another thing that we've done in Perrineville, we've tried to address some of those water quality issues by changing the way that we behave in our homes. We've worked with homeowners to install rain gardens, and we surveyed them about what incentives and might encourage them to do so. And these are some of our results from that. In the interest of time, though, I'm going to speed right through that. But the important point to take away is that the things that you do at home, like your runoff from your yard and your car and your house, your apartment, that is affecting the stream. And so we got to change the things that we're doing at home if we're going to improve the habitat for fish. One of the funnest parts of this project is working with the wildlife. And so these are some photos of some of the wildlife we found at Japanese Gulch. We confirmed 35 species in the Gulch, identified 7 that had never been recorded before in the Gulch. Some of those include American shrew mole, the black bear. You can see the scat from the black bear in the picture. River otter and bufflehead and greenweed teal and hooded merganser and red-legged frogs had never been documented in Japanese Gulch before, despite active wildlife monitoring there by other agencies and groups. And here's kind of showing you the concentration of the animals by their top spin species detections. Our most common is an invasive species known as the eastern gray squirrel. But then we see coyotes, raccoons quite high. And really exciting was the identification of the northern flying squirrel shown here. You can see the coyotes doing a little mating ritual there. And at Big Gulch, more pictures of northern flying squirrels, again, never identified either place before. We confirmed 7 species here that had been previously identified by others, and 30 species that had never been recorded before in Big Gulch. In Big Gulch, nobody had ever, well, only one group had ever really actively monitored wildlife there before. And so that we knew of anyway. And so ones we found there was that those flying squirrels, Pacific jumping mouse, California quail, and northwestern garter snake are some examples. Here is a photo of a coyote with a mountain beaver in its mouth that one of our cameras caught. Here you can see again the highest concentration are invasive species, the eastern gray squirrel, but we can see a river otter, we can see deer. So we do have quite a few deer in Big Gulch, raccoons, beavers, not as many coyotes as in Japanese Gulch, but in Japanese Gulch we had coyotes raising pups right near our camera, so we got lots and lots of photos for them. So anyway, that's a quick overview. What's next? Our wildlife monitoring continues, and Grace, who's on the call, leads that. We hope to have an archaeology field school in the summer of 2022. It's undetermined whether that's going to be in Japanese Gulch or somewhere else, but there is some work being done in Japanese Gulch to open up the waterfront. They're going to daylight the creek, and so there's definitely need for continued water quality monitoring, maybe some archaeology there. And so this is where a view of what the city plans to do. They plan to open the creek, it looks like this right now, and open that up into a park and allow the stream to go back and forth and a walkway to go through it. So it's going to be really beautiful when they get done. And that project is ongoing right now. And then our green team is leading some water quality monitoring there. So in summary, the community-based anthropology responds to needs identified by the community and uses service learning of students and anthropological research tools to help address those needs. The successful repatriation of salmon to Bekeltiyu after an absence of 50 or more years illustrates the value of community-based archaeology, rooted in strong partnerships with tribes, local governments, nonprofit organizations, and conducted in conjunction with cultural, biological, linguistic, and of course, water quality monitoring. I'd like to end with a call to action to those students here to explore our library resource guide. There's a link here, and I will share that here, and I'll put that link in the chat and encourage you to check that out. And then I'll turn the time back for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. That was great. Right from the first slide, you had stories and experiences to share with us. That was beautiful. I enjoyed it. So if we have any question, please unmute, ask your questions, type it in the chat. We've got a few minutes, but we enjoyed it. So I didn't want it to end, but we have to honor the time of people. So that was great. Thank you.
So I'll ask a question. Those streams, what are we going to find upstream? It looks like they end just at Payne Field. Is that as far as the road goes for the salmon? I know salmon can swim hundreds of miles to get to where they're going to spawn. So I don't know if before Payne Field, where was their destination? I guess I'm curious.
Yeah, well, mainly salmon are using that lower part of the creek for their spawning. So they're really interested in those first couple of miles of a Puget Sound tributary that's small like that. Okay. If it was a large river or something, yeah, they could go up, hundreds of miles. But here, the stream itself is only a few miles long, and so they're not going to be able to go all the way up. And so we've found them. I think about almost a couple miles up Big Gulch, but not much beyond that. And there's not barriers preventing them, so it's their own preferences that they're going about as far as they can. So in Big Gulch, I don't think that there's anything we can do to open up more habitat. I think it's different at Japanese Gulch. If we could figure out a way to get salmon through the culvert under 5th Street, there's a detention pond up there that might make good rearing habitat, and there's more stream that could serve as spawning habitat that I think they would use if they could get through that culvert. And so far that no one's taking that task on. But I think the more immediate thing is to get the salmon back into the habitat that we cleared up by removing the invasive species. And so I keep reminding the city that that needs to be done. And so far it hasn't been done. Would make a good service learning project when we can do projects again.
Yeah.
It would. Is there let me ask my next question. So I was, before I heard this, I was going to go, well, I think from the video I saw beforehand that, you know, the water is pretty good. So what's the point of continuing to monitor? Then I heard the story about, well, you know, they saw this anomaly, and that, you know, so it's obviously it's monitoring. It's not just a cleanup site. So, but you know, I wonder what other sites would be kind of another priority to look at in our community, if any. I mean, I'm sure there are, but.
Well, I think all of our streams around here that are Puget Sound tributary, well, the larger ones, I should say, would be the priority. So Lund's Gulch is a really high priority. Perrinville Creek is another high priority. Now, students from Edmonds Woodway are working on a couple of the other streams a little further north of Perrinville. So, you know, I wouldn't try to duplicate their efforts. Linwood High School is doing some work on Lund's Gulch. So, you know, for us to concentrate on Perrinville, Big Gulch, and Japanese Gulch is really kind of the ideal, because, I mean, we could, no, I don't think anybody's working at Picnic Point, but that's another one that is pretty accessible, and that would be one to consider. I have a question. Do Grace and Alicia have anything to add on their parts that they contributed to this project?
I don't know if I have anything archaeological to add. You covered it pretty well, Tom. We did find that site back in, oh, I think it was 2009, 2011. It's, oh, it was a long time ago. But yeah, it was really good that the city was able to get the college involved. I thought that was a good move on their part, that you guys were able to get in there and investigate it. There's a lot of, as you say, there's a lot of rich history there, which is really important, and it's good that we've been able to, the college has been able to participate in recovering that information.
Yeah, and I should say that, you know, we had in our archaeology field school, we had 2 students who were direct descendants of people who'd been in the Japanese concentration camps that the United States had during World War II. And, you know, so just to be able to reconnect with that history of you know, their ancestors was really, really an important part of the field school.
All right, Tatum.
Yeah, well, thank you all for participating in our talk and our question and answer time. I know we're right at 4:30, so I'm going to close it up. But thank you to Dr. Murphy for sharing all those links while you were speaking. That makes my job a lot easier. I will just add our Green Team website link for anyone who wishes to learn more about our other virtual events, or we will also be publishing resources from this event to our page. So you can follow us on social media. You can read up on our upcoming events and activities, but that is all for Earth Month. Thank you so much for joining us.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't just say, you know, as the Green Team supervisor, I'm just really proud of the work you've done, not only putting this all together, but just the time you all took to make the video, which I thought was really well done. And so just all your efforts to keep this going. It really does fulfill the mission of the Green Team. So I just wanted to say kudos to you, and thank you for Tom for participating, and all our guests today for supporting our Green Team's efforts.
And if I can add my kudos to that as well, as you know, as many of you know, my wife had a stroke a couple of years ago, and that's really limited my ability to be able to do the things that I used to do, to lead students out doing these projects. And it's just so heartwarming to me to see the Green Team, to see Grace, to see Alicia, Leah, who was here earlier, stepping up and keeping those projects alive and going that I put so many years of heart and soul into. And, you know, things haven't dropped. And so it just really warms my heart for the work that you're doing, and makes me proud to have preceded you in this work.
Oh,
Thank you.
and a shout out to Haley too for supporting the green team too. And I never give enough credit to the AmeriCorps volunteers. So just want to, good job, Haley.
Yeah. In Coast Salish communities, we raise our hands to thank you. So thank you.